Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Howdy folks, and welcome to the OnePageRules month in review for April. Now, April has been a very busy month for OPR, and there's quite a bit to cover, so let's get into it. First of all, OPR demonstrates that it has a sense of humor. As it does every single year, April starts off with April Fools, and OPR decided to get into the gag by announcing that they would be releasing 3D printed 2D models. Now, I'm glad it was a gag, because when I first started reading the article, I thought to myself, that's a really dumb idea. So it's nice to see that OPR can bring a little levity into the hobby. Now, what isn't a joke is the next bit of news. This month marks the 10-year anniversary of OnePageRules. What started as a passion project to streamline an increasingly cumbersome 40K has now become a game system in its own right, complete with an ever-expanding range of STL files, a developing rule set, and even the beginnings of world building and lore. So in just one decade, it went from a simple Google Doc to a full-fledged company with a website, STL store, third-party miniature provider, free army builder, and social media. So congratulations to Gaetano Ferrara, and here's looking forward to the next 10 years. Next up, we have the release of the World Book for Grimdark Future. Now, the book came out early in April, and it sought to establish some of the foundational elements of lore and world building in the Sirius sector, as well as the wider galaxy beyond. Now, the book came out to generally positive reviews, even though there were some valid criticisms about the overall tone of the game and the extent to which the Grimdark Future is truly grim-dark. As I mentioned in my initial review video about the World Book, I also fall into this camp that generally sees the World Book as positive, but I have some reservations and questions about elements of the story and the setting, and as I mentioned in that video, I hope to get into that in a lot more detail when I do my deep dive video series on the World Book. So, moving on then. What we have that was a bit of a surprise to me, and I'm sure it was a surprise to a lot of you, OnePageRules updated the core rulebook, bringing the current version of the game to 3.3. Now, beside the usual tweaks to specific army units and loadouts, the big changes came to morale and a change to the charging activation. I've already made a video going over those in detail, so here I will just summarize. Morale in Melee remains pretty much unchanged, and units that fail a morale test with half or less than their starting size are still going to be routed. But in shooting, a failed morale test doesn't auto-pin a unit for the whole turn. Instead, that unit that fails morale becomes shaken, and it suffers a penalty to quality and defense as well as movement, and it will remain shaken until the controlling player uses their activation to recover. The next change is that when a unit that's activated and given the charge order can instead be given the assault order. The assault order allows a unit to both shoot and then charge into melee in the same activation at a slight cost to the penalty of quality in both shooting and in melee. It also cuts the charge distance in half. Now, this rule was created so that units that have both good shooting and melee can feel a little more like they perform on the tabletop the way that they look in the army list. So I hope that when OnePageRules holds their next community survey in June, they'll provide a chance for players to report on how these changes seem to be working out, if those comments and feedback isn't already given in the Discord. Now, as part of the announcement of an update for 3.3, OnePageRules announced that in future rules updates to the core rules are going to be made annually, with smaller tweaks being pushed to the Army Forge as needed. I think that's a very good idea, because it takes time for players to adjust to new rules, even if it's just to one or two areas of the core rule set. So nothing is as frustrating as feeling like you finally got a grip on the rule set, then to find out that it changes. So now let's shift and take a look at reoccurring items. For example, model releases. The April model release continues to develop the Vampiric Undead for Age of Fantasy and the High Elf fleets for Grimdark Future. Now, in my March review video, I got more than one comment telling me to just come out and admit that it was a paid review because it was a little bit too glowing. Seriously, I'm not sponsored by OPR, although wouldn't that be nice? What I didn't want to do was to make a video where I take someone else's time, effort, and work and take a massive dump on it. I don't want to be that guy. but it seems my desire to look more on the positive side came across a little bit too sunny and glowing. So going forward, I'll try and be a little more honest and balanced, having a little bit of praise with a little bit of criticism. So here we go. In regards to the High Elf models, I think the basic infantry look pretty good, and they have a look that's both sci-fi, but it still has the elegance that you would expect with a faction like the High Elves. Now, one complaint that I would raise is that some of the characters I don't think have quite enough to distinguish them as sci-fi elves. For example, this guy here. While a perfectly good sculpt all by himself, he'd fit right into a fantasy army. With the horns on the staff, the lack of anything that looks particularly futuristic in terms of armor or weaponry, I wouldn't know if this is from the far future or the distant past. Then there's these little guys. Now they appear in several sculpts, and they're a great example of the critique that the grim dark future is getting a little bit less grim and dark. These guys look like Pokemon. They're adorable, and I could see how some folks might think they look a little bit out of place. Now, I'm also not a huge fan of the vehicles. Now, it could be just looking at the gray STL rendering doesn't quite do it justice, and a good paint job can greatly change the way they appear. But the APC kind of looks like a triangle that's 9 months pregnant. I'm sorry, that was my initial reaction. I don't like harping on the negatives, but if I'm coming across as a shill, then I need to be a bit more blunt. I'm also a bit torn on some of the other elf machinery, like this walker here. It looks to me like it belongs more with the Robot Legion. Now, given the lore regarding the High Elves and the Robot Legion, that can make perfect sense. At least it would make sense right up to the point that the Legion becomes sentient and breaks away from the High Elves. It also goes a bit contrary to the APC. The APC is a solid mass, whereas this walker here is a lot more spindly. So I'm torn whether the aesthetic is to make everything sleek or whether to make it delicate. So now let's take a look at the Epic Plague Demon. And again, while it looks good on its own, you can clearly see there's a lot in common with the other large demon models. If you put the Plague Demon and the Chage Demon side by side, they look a little too similar. And when you have two armies that are supposed to be that different of an aesthetic and yet their big demons look identical, that can be, I think, a little bit counterproductive. Now, on to some of the positives. As far as the vampires go, I like them. I really do. I think they have a great look to them, and the designs are really well executed. I really don't have too many complaints there. And now that the vampiric undead are just about finished, OnePageRules has announced that the Shadow Stalkers are the new Age of Fantasy faction that's getting an overhaul. Now, the first batch of STL files aren't set to be released until June, but OnePageRules has posted a few sketches on their general Discord of concepts for the new STL files. On the good side, these definitely look creepy, dark, foreboding. Yes, the sketches absolutely match the name of the faction. On the downside, the sketches look to me a bit like a blend of ghostly undead, wormhole demons, and beastmen. Now, maybe when the final STL files come out, they'll look a little bit more distinct. But to me, these look like a conglomerate. Like you could put some of these models in any of those other three armies, and folks might not actually notice that it doesn't belong. Now, those of you listening can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I thought that the genesis, the idea for the Shadow Stalkers came from the Night Stalkers faction in Kings of War by Mantic Games. The idea was basically an army of living nightmares, like Cthulhu type stuff. Very different from wormhole demons. You look at the Night Stalkers from Mantic, and those are the kinds of things I think of when I imagine awful things that go bump in the night. Either those models, or if any of you have played Malifaux, stuff like the Neverborn. But these sketches for the Shadow Stalkers look more like a blending of current armies. In fact, you can see a rather significant change between the old aesthetic and the new. If we take a look at the old image that was on the Army Forge for the Shadow Stalkers next to this new one, the army is clearly going in a different direction. Now, one exception from my criticism here is that great Screecher. I think that definitely looks like a living nightmare, and I mean that in a good way. Now, on the subject of new icons in the Army Forge, many of the armies have gotten some facelifts. OnePageRules said, along with the release of the World Book and version 3.3, They want to take the artistic and physical presentation of the game to a higher level. So the older images that look like doodles or sketches in the margin of a college notebook are now being replaced with images that are much more detailed. And in many cases, they reflect the new STL files and the designs that have come out rather than simply copy the old 40K armies that they were modeled after. If you want to see some great examples of this at work, take a look at the before and after of the Robot Legions, the Wormhole Demons, the Infected Colonies, and the Dwarf Guilds. Okay, moving on. The next item included in the April release is something a little different. Not just models and monsters and infantry and vehicles. OnePageRules has always included large and small terrain for all the factions they produce, but this month's release has something different. It has modular terrain. Instead of printing a single building, tree, ruin, scatter terrain, or what have you, this collection allows you to print segments of walls, floors, and then assemble them however you want. In theory, this is a fantastic idea. It hands the hobbyist the reins to be as creative as they want to be and makes it possible for people to print massive pieces of terrain even if they have a smaller 3D printer. The one concern I have is that 3D printing, as great as it is, isn't perfect. There's always subtle errors here and there. And normally it's not a big deal because it's a single model that stands on its own, or at most a bigger model that has maybe 5, 6, 7, up to 10 pieces that go together. And if the model pieces don't quite align, a little bit of green stuff or some putty or something like that can fix it. But if you're going to be building massive pieces of terrain using dozens and dozens of these modular pieces, those individual flaws can eventually build up. So if any of you listening has tried any of these, has used these modular pieces to make larger buildings, let everybody know. Maybe post some pictures of it on my mini factory, because I'd be very curious to see how well a large-scale building project would work using smaller 3D printed pieces. Now, normally at this point, I would also talk a little bit about the painting competition, but I can't. In the last monthly review video I did, I showed you some of these submissions, not all, and I didn't spill any beans on who won or anything like that because that's supposed to be just for the Patreons. But the new stuff hasn't been released yet, so I wonder if maybe I stepped over a bound and now the whole community is being punished. I don't think I'm that big yet. I mean, I appreciate everyone who listens to me, but I'm certainly not the mover and shaker of the OnePageRules universe. So unfortunately, there's nothing to say about the monthly painting competition, and I can't show you some of the fantastic paint jobs that you all out in the community do. So what I think I'm going to have to do is, since every month's painting competition is announced the next month, we'll do things retroactively. So in April, we got to see March's stuff, and I already covered that in the March video. So instead, what I think I'll start doing is, starting in May, we'll talk about the April painting competition, where it is then public information to look at all of the winners, all of the submissions, and so on and so forth. So that's probably how it's going to look from here on, and apologies to OPR if I crossed any lines or boundaries previously. That was not my intent. So there it is, folks. That's the month of April in review for you. I hope you found that interesting and that you're as excited to continue on with this hobby as I am. In the meantime, keep your dice on the table, and remember, it doesn't have to be perfect as long as it's good enough.